Okay, welcome everyone to this panel. If you're wondering why you've been called here today, it's that it's all on you. We are here as a task force to resolve the most fundamental issue on the globe today, the severe discrimination, marginalization, disempowerment of women, the patriarchal prevailing mindset that is the root cause of everything that we're trying to transform, and a solving of which is a prerequisite to every single sustainable development goal. So you're a small but mighty team. I'm sure that we can do this together, and we've got an hour and a half to work out our action plan here. I wanted to start by reminding us of a fundamental principle of gender in development, and that was put forward by the famous economist Esther Boserup in 1970. She pointed out that in any developmental issue where there's a gender gap, if you have a program or policy that is providing more support to men than women, you are contributing to the problem, not solving it. You are strengthening the gender gap, not reducing it. So for a lot of people, I hear, oh, we're up to 30% female participation. That means you're up to 20% negative points on expanding the gender gap. And this is something that we have to analyze today. The Sustainable Development Goals, as you know, were just adopted last September 30th and went into force at midnight, January 1st of this year. 17 goals that build on but are fundamentally different than the MDGs. They encompass all countries, rich and poor alike. It's a universal agenda to leave no one out, to take care of not only human beings but our planet home with shared prosperity for all with no one left out. They recognize that the challenges identified that we will solve by 2030 are interlinked and require integrated solutions and a transformative process to get us there. This is a big change. The MDGs went instantly in silos, and unless each of us here personally take on integrated strategies, they will go into silos again. So the SDGs incorporate gender much better than the MDGs, which is a good thing, because in assessing the progress that the MDGs made in gender, the UN Women Report, led by Laura Torquay here, concluded that this was a collective failure of leadership in the lack of progress made on gender equality during the MDG era. In fact, the #1 bullet point in the final MDG report was that gender equality continues to persist. So this is what we're going to take on today. We're going to do it interactively, and we're going to do it with a pretty sophisticated gender lens. So we're going to look at a series of the put on your gender lenses. Excellent, thank you. We're going to look through 4 aspects of gender integration into addressing different SDGs. One are gender integrated policies, the kind of decisions by governments and other actors and their budget allocations that have gender through and through to meet these SDGs. The second pathway are gender integrated programs, the programs that implement those policies. The third is gender integration research. What do we need to know, that the knowing of which will empower us to meet these goals? And then advocacy and messaging. Who do we need to get to with what message? And you're going to work on these in teams. We'll break up in just a minute, but will the 10 team facilitators please stand? Great. So when we break up, okay, sit. When we break up, they will stand again, and if you're sitting next to one of them, you will cluster with them and they will assign you your SDG, and you will solve it. So no pressure. So for the first part of today, and I gotta watch our time because we're squeezing in 8 hours of work into these 90 minutes. Okay, so we have some distinguished panelists with us today, people whose individual contributions and organizational impact on these issues are extremely important to the success of our mission. Ann Huddock is here, Senior Vice President at PACT.
International.
Sorry,
USA.
Plan International. P is my favorite.
My boss is sitting over there, so Tessie, I just want you to know I have not jumped ship. I'm not with PACT. I'm still with Plan.
Sorry, I've been on the phone all morning.
But I love PACT and
Yes,
the
we
work
love
they
it.
do.
So Plan International, and who's done some truly pioneering work on integrated strategies, community-based strategies, and particularly gender-focused strategies. And Laura Turkay, who has managed the production of that awesome report that you have on your chairs for UN Women. I know a lot of us in this room really lobbied hard for the UN to have a UN Women, a gender entity that's really up to the challenge. So we're really pleased to have you both here. And they will demonstrate the application of this analysis to 2 of the SDGs. Anne will look at what some of us consider actually the most important SDG, SDG16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions, through this 4-point lens. Then Laura will look at SDG 8, Decent Work and Economic Growth. Very clearly important to be engendered. I'll talk about ending hunger, because I work for the Hunger Project. And then we will break into 10 teams, 2 for each of the MDGs, and we'll go to work on a similar analysis. We'll report it all back, and then we'll head out into the world and make it all happen. So how does that sound? Great. Okay. So I'm then pleased to pass the mic to Anne, who will look with us at SDG 16.
Thank you. Do I need to turn this on? So the first thing I wanted to do is just read the actual language of SDG 16. And very helpfully, one of the sessions this morning had passed out this SDG 16 paper. So I took the extra ones that were left on the chair to be environmentally friendly, and I left them here on the corner of the stage just in front of that podium. So if you'd like it, it's there for you. I thought we could recycle it. But the language is important because it says it's to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access
Anne,
to...
talk louder or closer to the mic. They're
Sure.
not hearing you in the back, thanks.
Provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So I would suggest that the words inclusive, sustainable, for all, effective, accountable, and inclusive really require us to put a gender lens on this SDG. And it's important to ask, as we're looking at accountable institutions, who are they accountable to? For whom are they accountable? And I think this is one of the SDGs, as I highlight that, it's where the gender lens is needed most, because the most significant failures in development, in my view, have come from the failure to integrate women into reconstruction and post-conflict efforts. And if you look at the UN Resolution 1325 that talks about, number 1, getting women at the peace table, so for peace talks, and number 2, getting women into reconstruction efforts, there have been a lot more successes, still not enough, but a lot more successes with getting women to the peace table. There have been very few good examples of women being deeply engaged in meaningful ways in the reconstruction efforts. In fact, quite the opposite. With the reconstruction often comes the undermining of roles that women will play during conflicts that grow out organically of a reshaped set of social norms, of new economic opportunities, because during the war, many of the men are gone fighting, or they've disappeared, or they don't come back for any number of reasons post-war. And those spaces that get created for women are the very organic spaces that need to be not only kept open, but built upon in Reconstruction. And I'm sure many of you have seen or even been a part of looking at efforts that do exactly the opposite. They come in as if it's a clean slate with often external lenses on the conflict and what's needed for reconstruction. And so, you know, instead of building on these organic efforts, those external assistance frameworks really start from scratch. And I think that that's something we have to look at really carefully. So I was, as John said, going to touch on the 4 quadrants that you're going to be looking at in your group, the 4 areas of policy, programs, research, and advocacy, and just to kind of suggest some ways in which we might want to think about this a little differently, this SDG and putting a gender lens on it. So the first is the area of policy, and it's really important to overhaul the macroeconomic frameworks. Assistance has to recognize the ways in which women cope during the conflict. Without doing that, we're not going to be able to build in any meaningful way on the progress that's been made. And so it's trying to promote these new wartime roles that many women take up in order to survive, to support their families. And how do we then translate those into new roles in the post-conflict world? You know, if you look at the amount of, and this gets into the research a little bit, but if you look at the amount of research on what happens during conflicts, it is very heavily skewed towards women as victims and women as survivors of abuses during conflict, and how to support those women after the conflict. There is very little, if any, evidence that talks about the economic work that women do to keep their families going, and how their communities then benefit from that, and how we might build upon that. So the programmatic areas, to move to the second quadrant, you know, there are 5 areas that seem to make a lot of sense for post-conflict reconstruction for women. And as we talked in a lunch table about integrated programming, I would suggest that these 5 areas need to be required for any kind of post-conflict reconstruction effort that's going to benefit women. And this is in part based on comparing and contrasting Rwanda and Sierra Leone, 2 very horrific wars that happened in recent past, and where women emerged very, very differently from each of those countries, and today continue to live very different realities because of the way assistance was structured. So those 5 areas are, the first is land rights. And you know, that's just critical for any kind of redevelopment effort that women are going to be a part of, because particularly in Africa, where so many conflicts are, women are the ones who are doing the agrarian work. And that during the conflict, when men leave, many times women are able to translate those small-scale producer efforts into much bigger efforts, sometimes feeding the rebels or feeding cross-border troops, but nevertheless building upon their small-scale agricultural efforts. And so making sure that, as in Rwanda, because there were so many men who had died, making sure that women can inherit land, women can own land, that unpacking the customary and the formal land tenure systems, those are critically important elements of reconstruction for women. The second is political representation. And again, this is where many women take leadership roles. They step into even formal leadership in their communities. And then when the post-conflict time comes, they're often squeezed out of those very same roles. And so they tend to feel sometimes that either they don't have the right skills or that their voice isn't as well regarded. Oftentimes, I mean, just recently in Zambia, there were horrific charges put forward about women candidates who were very few and far between in the electoral cycle that had just happened. But, you know, they brought up things about women's divorces and women not being able to really provide for their families, so how could they possibly be in the public domain? So it's really helping women who are going to face a particular set of challenges and critiques whether it's their appearance or their personal life. And that's not to say men don't face those same sorts of criticisms or scrutiny, but women experience it differently because of their social roles and the expectations of them. So helping them to be ready for that and withstand those pressures. The third is savings groups. And access to financial services in general is critically important, including credit, but savings groups are really important because that's the way in which women can begin to build from their own priorities and thinking about their futures. And no matter how small that savings is, put into the group and utilized in the right ways, that can provide options and opportunities when few other things will exist. Leadership training is very much related to the political representation, but this is something that women around the world that we've worked with in our Global Women in Management program have said they value more than any other thing that we've trained them in, that they see the ability to understand and see themselves as a leader is foundational to their success, that having advocacy training or entrepreneurship or budget training is really important, but what they need even before that is the ability to see themselves as a leader. And so, there's a phrase that says, if you see it, you can become it. In many of these countries and contexts, of course, women don't see leaders around them as role models. And so it's helping women, starting where they are, to see themselves as leaders. And often in conflict settings, women will, even unwillingly or sometimes very reluctantly step into a leadership role, but without any of the formal skills that would really set them up for success. And then the last programmatic area is probably the most obvious one, and that's psychosocial support. And it's just been shown that there's really no sense in trying to do programs post-conflict for women unless psychosocial support is included, because women have often gone through such horrific experiences during the war. So moving quickly to research, I think there's a really rich agenda here. And for anyone who's coming out of an academic organization or just for SID in general, I think this is an area where, nothing very much exists. And there's obvious reasons for that, because looking at conflicts, not many people go into a conflict zone to research how women are surviving and thriving. But there are ways to do this responsibly and to track how women are supporting their families and their communities. And more investment really needs to be made to do that. As I mentioned before, there's so much work that's been done on women as victims and women who have survived the atrocities. That's critically important, and I'm not suggesting that that should stop. But we need to add into this women as agents of change and understand how women are coping during the war. So much of women's participation during wars happens informally, so that's another reason why it's not tracked very well. And it's been said that what is unmeasured is unseen, and so we need to make a much more deliberate effort to see those contributions and to measure them. There's been a study that many of you have probably read that the McKinsey Global Institute put out very recently that said if women participated at the same rate as men, then there would be up to $28 trillion or 26% of incremental global GDP by 2025. That's a lot of resourcing. Yes. So if you don't agree with me on any other point, if you don't think any of this is important, hopefully those metrics will convince you that this is an important area for us to focus on. And lastly, on advocacy, I've raised a lot of the points that I think need to be included in an important advocacy agenda. But first and foremost is that women are not victims only. We need to stop painting the pictures of war as women are victims and need to have assistance. Women have been brutalized, women have been victimized, but women are also vibrant agents of change, and any reconstruction effort that doesn't include them is not a sustainable or inclusive or accountable one. Secondly, women need to drive that reconstruction, because so many times it's women who are left in the communities or fending for the families. They know what the realities are. And so a reconstruction effort that dismisses that reality or builds around it or over top of it is not going to be a sustainable one, and it's not actively engaging the people who are frankly the most expert many times in the coping mechanisms that work. And moving those coping mechanisms from survival into thriving really requires building on that organic effort that they've made. And lastly, I would be a terrible representative of plan if I didn't raise this issue, but it's critically important to look at adolescent girls and the unique ways in which adolescent girls are affected in conflicts. And so making sure that reconstruction efforts prioritize adolescent girls, particularly their social and emotional learning, to both mitigate risks and to allow them to be more productive. You know, we could spend all day cataloging the different ways in which adolescent girls face trauma during war and how it limits their schooling and how it hinders their health status. And so it's really important when that conflict ends to think about what do we need to do differently with adolescent girls? Who are the adolescent girls who might be overlooked? And to make sure that we don't have a lost generation then that results from the conflict.
Great, thanks, Anne. Okay. Next, we'll hear from Laura Turquet on the employment and growth goal.
Great, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, so thank you very much. So as John said, it's now widely accepted that gender equality underpins progress on all of the SDGs. And the fact that we have this strong standalone goal on gender equality and women's empowerment in the SDGs framework is a hugely important step forward. In addition, we have gender equality targets and indicators mainstream throughout the framework. And this is a real step forward compared to the MDGs, and I think gives us a very strong foundation to start on. My organization, UN Women, was very closely involved in supporting the intergovernmental process of agreeing the SDGs, as many of you were, making the strong case that there needed to be a standalone goal as well as gender mainstreaming throughout the framework, and of also negotiating the targets and indicators. And we will, going forward, play a key role in monitoring the implementation of the SDGs. So in terms of looking at how gender equality intersects and interlinks with the rest of the framework, I'm going to focus on SDG 8, which is to promote inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent work for all, and also look at how that interacts with SDG 5 on gender equality. And this analysis draws on UN Women's flagship report, Progress of the World's Women, which you all have on your chairs. The last edition of which was launched last year and focuses on women's economic and social rights. And the report examined 3 main policy areas. So work, both paid and unpaid, social policies, including both transfers and services, and importantly, macroeconomic policies. And by the way, if you don't want to take the heavy report home, it's also available online. So what has gender equality got to do with economic growth? We hear, as we just have from Anne, that there's a lot is said about the importance of empowering women and girls for the growth of economies. And research shows that where women and girls have greater access to education and higher levels of labor force participation, economies grow faster and stronger. However, the reverse relationship doesn't always hold. Economic growth does not necessarily lead to gender equality. It kind of depends on what sort of economic growth you have. And one of the most important determinants of whether economic growth is inclusive is whether it creates decent jobs. So recognizing this link, one of the targets of SDG 8, which I'm going to focus the rest of my comments on, is by 2030 achieve full and productive employment and decent work for all women and men, including for young people and persons with disabilities, and equal pay for work of equal value. So I'm just going to quickly outline some of the challenges to meeting this target from a gender perspective, and then I'll talk about some of the policies and programs and some of the research and advocacy that is needed to get us there. So first, the target aspires to achieving full and productive employment, but globally we see a huge gender gap in labour force participation of around 26 percentage points. So while more than 3/4 of men are in the workforce globally, only about half of women are. And in some regions, including South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa, female labour force participation has either stalled or declined since 1990. Women also typically have higher rates of unemployment than men, and this is particularly true for young women. So in the Middle East and North Africa, we see an amazing 51% of young women aged 15 to 24 were unemployed in 2013. compared to 23% of young men. And both numbers are, extremely high and a devastating loss of potential for young people. But we can see that for young women, it's a particular problem. Secondly, the target aspires to achieving decent work. And this is in recognition of the fact that the quality of work really matters. And I think, decent quality work can be a real foundation for women's empowerment, but it has to be, good quality work, decently paid to be able to support a decent standard of living, safe and healthy working conditions, and access to social protection. But in reality, we see that, especially in developing regions, 3/4 or more of women's employment is informal employment, which tends to lack protection of labor laws, it lacks access to social protection, and so on. In some countries, virtually all of women's employment is informal. In recent years, the issue of safety at work has kind of come to the fore with some, very sort of shocking realities of, for example, the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh, where a huge factory collapsed, killing 1,000, mainly young women garment workers, and injured twice as many, twice the number again. And interestingly as well, given that the SDGs is a universal agenda, it applies to rich and poor countries alike. Informal employment, such as low-paid self-employment, 0 hours contracts, and so on, are becoming much more common in some developed countries, including the UK, where I'm from. So third, the target includes the aim of achieving equal pay for work of equal value. And again, we know that in rich and poor countries alike, there are still huge gender gaps in terms of pay. In the report, we looked at the data available globally and found that on average, women earn 24% less than men. The pay gap is a complex phenomenon, and in many ways it can be seen as an indicator that labor markets are biased against women. One of the key drivers is occupational segregation, whereby women tend to be clustered in a limited set of undervalued occupations and stuck at the bottom rungs of the ladder. And fourthly, to achieve the target, one of the big challenges that we face is the unequal distribution of unpaid care work. So this is the kind of foundation for all economies. It's the work that is done in households around the world to care for children, to care for older people, to provision for households. And without it, frankly, the global economy would grind to a halt. There would be no labor force, and public services would not be able to cope with the strain of caring for all the people that need care. But when we look at time use surveys globally, we see that women do 2.5 times as much of this unpaid care and domestic work as men. And the problem with this is that it limits women's opportunities and choices to do other things. So especially where there's a lack of support and services that can support this kind of work, women's options for accessing good quality paid work are extremely limited. There's evidence that women's labor force participation declines quite sharply around the time that they're most likely to become mothers. So then, if these are all the challenges, what are some of the solutions that we can bring forward? And I think it's really important to have this conversation about the policies that we need to get us there, because so far with the SDGs, I hear a huge amount of discussion about the targets and the indicators, and a huge amount of discussion about data and how we're going to measure them. But I think there's still, at least in the conversations that I've been having, a sort of lack of discussion about what are the policy options. What are the political kind of discussions that we need to be having about the kinds of policy frameworks we need? So I'm going to highlight 3 areas. The first is about policies to recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care work. I should say, by the way, this is not an issue that is mentioned in SDG 8, but it is mentioned in SDG 5, which is really important. So recognizing unpaid care work is about understanding the value of this work and integrating it into policy making. And here, just to sort of touch on the research issue, one of the things that we see as a huge gap is we need more and better time use surveys, which look at how individuals within households use their time on different types of tasks, so that we can track how much time is being spent on unpaid care work and how it's being distributed within the household. The second aspect is about reducing unpaid care work. So this is specifically about reducing the drudgery of the kind of the provisioning that women and girls often have to do for their households in low-income countries, you know, carrying water, collecting firewood, and so on. And then redistributing the work is about having a better balance of this work between women and men, but also between states and families. And there are a number of policies we can, you know, in terms of family-friendly work policies, about childcare services, and so on. The second set of policies is about improving the quality of women's informal employment. As I mentioned before, a huge proportion of women's employment is informal. It's, you know, and much of it is self-employment. And sometimes it's referred to as micro-entrepreneurship. But actually what we're talking about is very low-paid, survival-oriented own-account work, like street vending, subsistence farming, industrial outworking, and so on. And so we need a range of policies that can better support this work and make it more viable and remunerative. So an example here is to invest in city infrastructure so that you know, street vendors have safe places to sell their goods. They have places they can store their goods. They have accessible public transport, and so on. And then lastly, policies to reduce gender pay gaps. As I said, gender pay gaps tend to be a symptom of labour markets that aren't working for women. And the policies that I've already mentioned on supporting women's unpaid care work are one really important element of a policy framework here. The implementation of minimum or living wages is also very important. Because women are overrepresented among low-paid workers, minimum wages can help to lift the pay of these workers and narrow gender pay gaps and redress women's poverty. So in summary, I've outlined why gender equality is needed to achieve inclusive economic growth, which is the aim of SDG 8. And I've zoomed in on one of the key targets of this goal, which is about achieving decent work for all and equal pay for women and men. I've outlined some of the key barriers, and I've provided some of the examples of the kinds of policies and programs that are needed to address these challenges. So I'll leave it there, and I very much look forward to our discussion.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so SDG 2 calls for ending hunger, achieving food security, and improved nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture. And as I think we all know, the vast majority of food farmers are women. They are largely voiceless, and they suffer severe discrimination in public services, agricultural inputs, training, and everything. Here's a quote from Robert Chambers. "There's been a massive shift of rhetoric and a notably less massive shift of real priorities towards rural women and their needs." The bad news is that that quote is from 1982, and it's still true today. Rural women lack voice. They live in remote areas, and the closest government services to them are virtually powerless. So everything that Anne said about SDG 16 applies equally well to SDG 2. Unless there are vibrant, responsive, inclusive institutions led by women at the grassroots rural level, those institutions simply don't exist for rural women, and they will never have the opportunity to express their fundamental human right to participate in governance. So decentralization and devolution are a big priority for rural women. A lot of the policies that Anne mentioned also apply to peacefully poor rural women. Land rights are an appalling situation. Policies are needed. Policies currently in most countries are heavily promoting the production of low nutrition grains and are discriminatory against high nutrition foods. It's been shown in just basic food production that if women had the same access to training and inputs as men, they would have, we would bring 150 million people out of hunger. So this is a big deal for hunger. Feed the Future, which I think some of you heard about this morning. It's designed to be a pro-women initiative. And yet, the percentage of men applying improved inputs under Feed the Future is 64% versus 36% women. The number of people trained is 55% men, 45% women. So it doesn't yet meet the Bostrup criteria, and knowing those numbers and advocating for their implementation has got to be a top priority for ending hunger. Hunger isn't just about food. It's about nutrition and the education needed to understand nutrition, the engendered behavior change, halting child marriage, which requires other forms of safety against other forms of gender-based violence. So that needs to happen. End of impunity against gender-based violence, particularly in rural areas, means, again, stronger institutions at those areas and voice for women. Programmatically, programs need to invest in the organizations of rural women. One organizer I met said there's no shame in being poor, but there's a shame in being unorganized poor. And women in particular, when they have organizations for mutual empowerment and collective voice, they can make a big difference in policies. In terms of research, IFPRI and a whole series of researchers working with IFPRI have done incredible work on developing the Women's Empowerment and Agricultural Index, an incredible tool that has yet to be generally applied, but that's a tool I think all of us can use. I know the Hunger Project has a simplified version instead of WEAI, it's just WEI, we. But measuring women's empowerment in all the domains of income and voice and capabilities, and those have to be measured. And in terms of advocacy, having people get it truly, that it's women who grow the food in our world and that they are being marginalized and disempowered is a message that has yet to reach policymakers. It just isn't getting there. And we need to get that message across. And second, that it's not just about growing more food. The world has plenty of food, but it's all unnutritious. So we need major focus on nutrition, particularly for adolescent girls and pregnant mothers up to the child's second birthday. That has to happen. So, in summary, those are some of the links. Now, your turn. So, you will have a total of 20 minutes to do this work. So, would the team captain stand up? Stand up even faster. Okay, good. So cluster around one of these ACE volunteers. They will inform you of your goal. You will get stickies. Write your ideas in those for those 4 quadrants in those stickies. You will go with them over to those sticky placement facilities on the wall, and you will come up with your strategies for your SDG. Get ready, get set, go.
Yeah, I'm sitting here. Yep. It'd be nice if we were quick.
Oh yes, we're gonna go.
Yes, please go be part of the project. 15 minutes.
Yeah. I want to see stickies flying onto the walls. Let's get those stickies up there. Okay, you have 5 more minutes on this part of the process. 5 more minutes. Okay, stop. Now, the next step is in each group, one person for each quadrant will summarize that quadrant in no more than 10 words. Then when we report back 5 minutes from now, each team will have no more than a 40-word report on their work. Okay, do this for 5 minutes. Yes. And then Laura's going to take it back and have the UN Secretariat also commit to this kind of conciseness.
We're going to sum it up in 140 characters.
That would be 10 very long words.
So how many people work in the whole project?
A couple people. So we have no expats. We have all local teams, chapters. Total staffing in 22 countries. Well, 10 fundraising countries and 12 program countries. 420 staff total. 20 headquarters in New York.
In New York.
Yeah, and 2 here in Washington. And Mary Kate Costello, who's on your women is heading the youth engagement working group, and she's on that with Danny Robbie.
Oh, yes.
You were once our biggest funder. The UN Women funded our women's leadership program in India. That special money from the Norwegians, which unfortunately then dried up. But it was $1 million a year. We work with 120,000 Oh, and I brought you this. Here's our Africa program.
Thank you. Yeah, Norway's now, I was in Norway recently, they're now focusing a lot of their money on education. No, training women leaders.
I once got an education grant for it under that argument. This is education. It's exciting stuff. But I really appreciate kind of talking about women's leadership because just always it's so missing. And there was about 2 weeks in the 80s when investing in women's organizations at the grassroots was a fad, and then it dried up. But it's really missing.
No, I mean there's been a lot of sort of chatter within the feminist circles about obviously gay statistics analysis, 80 million for gender data, which is great. We're going to benefit from some of it, and it's all good. But imagine if Gates said we're going to give 80 million to women's organisations.
Women's organizations?
And I don't mean with all the best of the world, I don't mean
Well, we've just gotten
international,
some
I mean-
money from DASRA, the Corporate Social Responsibility Network in India, for this work. It's not big, but it's a fascinating first step. We've never been able to charge any kind of corporate money to encounter that kind of stuff. There's 2 wireless mics there. I think so. That's what I was going to ask.
We've got a bell between us. And you used to be a scientist.
It's true, I did.
So what made you?
The Africa famine,
Which one?
the 84 one.
Really?
I knew I'd never get my hands around the politicians causing these problems as a volunteer. Okay, reporteros. Attention, everybody, stop talking, stop consolidating. Shh. Okay, in each group, who's ever going to present the 40 words, go to whichever of these two microphones is closer, and we will start with the group that handled SDG1, no poverty. Who will go first? Okay, SDG1 people, up to the mic.
Going first has its burdens. We are still building. However, on the policy side, abolish regulatory barriers, provide adequate support resources regardless of gender. On the advocacy side, reducing poverty requires 50, okay, there we go, it's numbers, not words, 50% of the population. And then support financial private sector caregiving and sustainability and effectiveness. And then finally, data for research, data collection, comparative research, poverty, I think. That's the problem with it coming up late. And understand women's role in politics, business, entrepreneurship, and employees.
Excellent, thank you. Yay, 1A. Okay, team 1B. Oh, you were combined. That was two groups. Great. Terrific. Okay, so next is SDG. Oh, response before we do that. Okay.
Oh, right away. Should we do all of them in that spot? No?
What?
No? Okay. Okay. Yes, I think there were some really interesting points there. Some of them I didn't quite get. So there was, I think one of the points was about corporate supported caregiving, which I assume is about trying to get private companies to have, progressive policies for supporting families with kids. Is that right? So in terms of yeah. Uh-huh. Yep, I think that's really important, and one of the things that comes into a number of the goals. I think another one. Tell me more about the reducing regulatory something.
Reducing regulatory barriers.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of barriers written into laws
Okay.
in many countries that women can't do this, women can't do
Yeah.
that. And going beyond, initially reducing and removing those barriers, and going beyond gender-neutral practice law.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just repeat that in case people didn't hear. I think what that team has really well recognized is that there are a huge number of discriminatory laws still on the books which limit particularly all sorts of aspects of women's lives, but the World Bank has a very important report called Women, Business and the Law, which looks at the discriminatory legal provisions that prevent, for example, women setting up a business in their own name or being able to choose which job they do, work at night time, for example. There's a huge range of discriminatory laws, so I think that's a very, very important point as well.
Very good.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, cheers for SDG1. Woo! Next, do we have one SDG3 team or two teams? Two SDG3 teams. Okay, SDG3 team, the first one at the mic, please. Your 40 words.
40.
Okay, hit it.
Or less.
Or less.
There's a lot of grace in the room, right?
Okay.
Okay. Empowerment of CHWs. Does everyone know what that is? I learned today. Community health workers.
Oh. Great.
So an environment favorable to that. Okay. Unbiased access. So to give a little bit more, those are my 2 words. But now the color about them, meaning removing barriers where people have to identify themselves as married or unmarried, or they have permissions from a parent or a spouse or other. So again, the 2 words are unbiased access. I think I'm up to 4. Youth friendly.
Clear?
And the other 2, safety and security. So
Safety and security.
creating environments where
Yes. It's clear. You just
is
get the
it
10
clear?
words.
Great. I'm done.
Okay, next 10 words.
Okay, programs. We have access, education and training. We have early diagnostic treatment and prevention, community involvement, social accountability, gender involvement.
Great.
Wow.
Those are great 10 words.
For research, government spending disaggregated for women, and question the gender binary.
Excellent. Excellent.
For advocacy, rights-based, RMNCAH resources, and mental health.
Fabulous. And Judge Laura is again on number 3.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm a judge in this. Yeah, I mean, I think those are all really excellent. In Progress, we looked particularly at the role of community health workers in some African countries, including Rwanda, in really having a huge impact on reducing maternal mortality. So I think how you craft health systems so that they're genuinely responsive to women's needs is the real challenge. The other thing that I would add is just in terms of the kind of macro picture would be about ensuring that governments have enough resources to really truly invest in strong health systems, that can really deliver for people on the ground. And I think that's one of the big challenges, dating back from the 80s and 90s where those were stripped back. So.
Okay, next health group. Yay, 3A. Okay, let's hear the 40 words from 3B.
So for policy, we came up with building capacity through access.
Can you speak up?
Building capacity through access to universal health care, funding distribution, quality assurance, and gender-sensitive policies on all levels.
Great. Next 10 words.
For programs, we had
Tilt the mic up to your mouth. Sorry.
for trainings we had for programs we had trainings for adolescents on family planning, nutrition, and healthcare access, and free vaccination programs.
Great, thank you. Next 10.
For research, we have family planning, monitoring, marketing, health, literacy, high nutrition food menu.
Fabulous, thank you.
For advocacy, we have community mobilization, family planning, nutrition, women's health, and halting child marriage.
Fabulous, thank you. Laura.
I will just say that I think it's great that you've highlighted sexual and reproductive health and rights, which was one of the areas that was very contested during the negotiations. So I think it's really important that we all recognize the advances that have been made in the SDGs framework and keep on keeping on that issue.
Yay, SHRH. Thank you, team. Okay, we're now going to SDG 4, quality education. 2 teams or 1? 2, okay. Your 40 words.
So
Stephanie.
we got 4, you guys we got 4
10 each.
sets. In policy we have targets, resources, safety, laws around FGM and child marriage, and then also policies at the school level. So not just talking about policies high
Right.
level. And just so you all know, it's SDG 4 around education. So.
Great, Stephanie, thanks.
So for programs, we have access to school and sustained attendance, positive masculinity, and GBV support.
Great, wow, good.
For research, we have measured disaggregated learning outcomes, citizen learning assessments, inclusive curriculum, and RTCs for around soft skills studies.
Wow.
Random country
Okay.
trials.
A voice for RCTs. Courageous. Next.
For advocacy, we have changing social norms, birth registration, value of girls' education, and role models and support groups.
Great. Okay, commentary, Anne.
Thank you. These are great. I think it's really important to hear under the programs, the focus on masculinity. I think that as we talk about gender, this is gender, not girls and women in development, so I applaud you for that one. And I think, again, on the advocacy, the importance of role models really can't be underestimated because, as I said earlier, if you can't see it, you can't really become it. So I think those are really key ones. It's great.
Great, thank you. Okay, moving right along, we had to pick up the pace here. Next
We're
group.
at SDG4 as well, and given it's the development community, I created a small acronym for this. So this is KAHGR. My words are comprehensive
Memorable.
and holistic guidelines/policies on education, including access, accountability, vocational training, and SRHR.
Excellent, thank you.
For programs, we have education that empowers women in sex, money, jobs, and life.
That's great.
Perfect.
For research, we have women and girls with disabilities, including the link of education to access to economic opportunity, sex education research, and gender and sexual diversity norms.
Fabulous, excellent, thank you.
Okay, for advocacy, we have comprehensive, inclusive approach to women's leadership and representation in education.
Great.
Great.
Good work, team. Commentary, Anne.
Yeah, just since we're short on time, I will quickly say I'm really thrilled to hear the link to the economic approach because one of the main reasons we know that girls get left out of school is that people do the hardcore economic calculation and realize that they're not going to go on to get jobs the same way that the boys and the men do. So that's really key. And then that's a great inclusion message on the disabilities, and that's such a critical part of access to education, we know. So well done for including that.
Great, thanks, Anne. Okay, moving to WASH. The water sanitation team. First group.
Hello. So for policies, we have affirmative policies that address environmental and infrastructure concerns. For programs, we have access, so access to latrines, access to water, and equitable access to water, community trainings, hand washing programs, and public-private partnerships. For research, innovative ways to purify water, hand washing programs, and innovative ways of using water. So for agriculture. And then advocacy, promoting soap usage, promoting purified water, and a mother and kids campaign.
Fabulous, excellent work. Yay, team. Next team.
Okay, same WASH. So for policies for WASH services, infrastructure, affordable access, and dumping and environmental concerns. For gender programs, easier access to infrastructure, education, women involvement, and public health. Advocacy and messaging, water collection norms, changing the norms, safety concerns, education, and inclusion. And research, researching the link between access to clean water, health, political participation, educational attainment, workforce participation.
Yay, WASH teams. Anne, commentary?
Yeah, I think it's so important, the issue of access, and I would just go one level deeper to say it's not just about access, but it's where those facilities are located. And I'm always reminded of my first experience working in Sierra Leone where some community group wanted to dig a well, and the NGO that was supporting it said that the well should be dug right in front of the chief's house because then the chief would monitor it and be sure it got taken care of. And of course, the local community said, then no one will ever use it because when women go to the well, that's when they get to regroup away from their husbands, away from sometimes their children. And so the well needs to be dug where the women want to see the well dug. And I never forgot that, so I wanted to add that to access. And then I think if I were to add anything else, it would be menstrual hygiene management as a really important issue to be concerned with. And then lastly, I just want to applaud the public-private partnership. And Darren Saywell, plans guru on WASH, just walked in. So he can tell you more about why that's so important.
Fabulous. Thanks for getting here. This is great. Okay. Now, on to climate action. Goal 13. Do we have one team or two? Two teams. Okay, first team.
Okay, on policies, it's actually 11 words, but it's one complete sentence. Women lead discussions on UN climate change framework incorporating gender analysis.
For programs, provide training, solutions exchange, proposal involvement, disaster preparedness / recovery, and grants.
Good.
For research, data collection, study gendered impact on health, economy, aquaculture for sustainable practices.
Excellent, thank you.
For advocacy and messaging, involve women and men and female-led organizations, tailor messages.
Excellent. Thank you, Group 1. Okay, Climate Group B.
What about you analysis?
I'll do both. I think that worked better than the last time.
For gender-integrated policies, ensure women are involved and funded to participate on all levels of combating climate change. Gender-integrated programs to educate, employ, fund, and include women in advocacy and entrepreneurship activities. Research climate change and land use impact on women. For advocacy and messaging, early education and initiatives to change behavior towards the environment.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. So I know our organization works with a lot of indigenous women's groups, and in many, many cultures, it is the women who are the carriers, the custodians of the traditional indigenous wisdom for sustaining the environment. And so I really appreciate the point about both gender analysis and women being at the table and funded to be at the table, because indigenous women in general don't have a big travel budget. And so getting to these things is really, really important. And I also think that getting the gender disaggregated data on impacts in some of these areas is really, really crucial. So thank you all for your work. So let's cheer for everybody's brainstorming. We have a few minutes more during which we could have any questions and answers that anyone has. New insights, proclaimed commitments to change everything in your organization. Any comments, questions that anyone has, this is the time we have for it. You guys are so brilliantly concise. We're actually a little early on that section. Anyone? Yes, please.
All right. I know you guys brought up a bunch of different challenges, and but what's the biggest gender challenge that you think you have as far as international development? And that's both women and men.
And say the last word again.
What's the biggest challenge?
Biggest challenge.
That you think we're facing in regards to international development, and that could be either women or men.
Yep.
And how do you plan on fixing it?
No, that's why we brought you here. So, Laura, biggest challenge, number one.
I would say that one of the things the SDGs has done is introduce this idea of leave no one behind. And I think that's hugely challenging because, I mean, it means we have to, I mean, it's a principle that's true to human rights principles, which is that human rights are universal, that, you know, many of these things are basic rights that countries have promised to do for a long, long time. And so it's absolutely right that we promise to do it, but how we actually implement that, I think, is hugely challenging.
Great. Anne?
I think the biggest challenge is one of the ones I mentioned earlier, and that's making sure that we don't always look at women as victims or look at women as, those who need support. I think framing the SDGs with a gender lens really means talking about how are women able to be agents of change. And since John quoted Robert Chambers earlier, I will also add one of my favorite Robert Chambers quotes, which is about making sure that we put the first last and the last first. And so I think one of the greatest challenges for organizations like ours when we go into these situations is to really make sure we're listening to first of all, that we're listening, and second of all, that we're listening to those who might be perceived as last, like, for example, the indigenous women.
Great, Ann, thank you. I would say I think the biggest challenge is funding for grassroots women's organizations. That we have seen the best investment that our organization has ever made is building those capacities and spaces for women to empower each other. Because as agents of change, they can do that if they have a chance. But that means, there needs to be a meeting room, there needs to be social permission. So getting women, those women change agents together and effectively able to they've made the shift from I can't to I can, and then to have the transformation from I can to we can is when you start to get real political change from the bottom up. Yes?
Hi, my name is Ryan Ubuntu, and I'm from Palladium, and I had a question regarding as gender becomes more and more blurred in spaces around the world, especially creating indicators and trying to create a global knowledge base around these, how do you specifically look at marginalized populations within these aka subgroups, such as people with disabilities, but also gender and sexual minorities and others who may not necessarily fall into a binary way of thinking around gender?
Very big question, particularly given the comments before about leaving no one out. Ann?
I would just cite the maybe somewhat surprising example of Vietnam, where I think there's a good lesson there in terms of, Vietnam invested so much in poverty reduction. And then until there was a big push internationally for Vietnam to look at the ethnic minorities, they were really left behind. But that outside pressure combined with Vietnam's desire to really alleviate poverty and become a middle-income country, they have done, I think, an increasingly better job of addressing those issues. And organizations like the World Bank had really supplied a lot of the gender technical expertise. They had one of the best gender experts in the world sitting in the World Bank office providing support to the Ministry of Ethnic Minorities. And so that's a really good example of where internal political will combined with external support, when a government shows that while we're still not prepared to really empower those communities because we still aren't entirely sure of what their agendas are, we are willing to give them greater space because we want to see progress on poverty reduction, and you can't do that without addressing their needs. So I think it's finding those examples and highlighting them and learning from those, and in my mind, combining the external pressure that sometimes can really help leapfrog the domestic efforts.
Yeah, I mean, on sexual orientation and gender identity, it's the issue that, in the UN space, at CSW each year, it's the issue that, causes, along with sexual and reproductive health and rights, causes, the most debates and arguments among countries. And, I personally would like to see the UN taking a much stronger leadership role in, the Secretary General has made some good statements, but I think, whereas in the past the UN has really been ahead of the curve on a lot of kind of new ideas and things, like climate change, like gender and development and so on, I think actually the UN's been behind the curve on this issue. Just a kind of plug for our next report, which is going to focus on families, and we are going to have, try to show that families, as a matter of fact, are diverse. Not just in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity, but in terms of single-parent families, transnational families, all sorts of intergenerational households, all sorts of different configurations of the way that people choose to live and nurture each other. And we want to make the case that policies really need to kind of catch up. So in the case of lesbian, gay, transgender families, how are social policy frameworks actually ensuring that these people have the right to, pensions, to other social benefits and so on. So it's a big challenge and there's a long way to go.
Yeah, it wasn't too long ago that Matthew Shepard was murdered in this country. And sexual minorities are being murdered around the world, and coming out can be a deadly issue. And so I really support the actions by this administration to fight for as much space as possible on the diplomatic front, to minimize the number of frontline deaths that are going to have to occur as people fight for their rights. You know, that people shouldn't have to die to fight for their rights. And so the more those in privileged position and power, such as the US administration, the EU, and others, can bring all their powers to bear to preserve the human rights of everybody, will save lives and will bring us to those days faster, so that people can organize. It would be, organizing at this point in many of the countries where we work would be deadly for those who tried to organize. So it's a tough one. Okay, yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Jeff Swedberg with IBTCI. We're a development firm focusing on monitoring and evaluation. And one of the things I'm curious about is we're trying to come up with ways to make our monitoring and evaluation more gender inclusive. But other than a few basic things such as always disaggregate your data by gender, what sort of ideas do you have for more gender inclusive monitoring and evaluation?
Great. I'm responsible for our monitoring and evaluation. I'll go first this time. Have women do it. So we're really committed to communities and people being the number one sources of data and the number one clients of data. And too often monitoring and evaluation is an extractive industry to serve the donors whose, frankly, commitment to gender might be there and it might not. But having grassroots people truly on the front lines of owning and generating their own data and being empowered and using it in their own advocacy, and then aggregating that up, is, I think, one of the best strategies for accomplishing that, because data, knowledge is power. And so if you are able to have M&E that emanates from the people themselves, then it has a double effect of measuring what's important to people as well as empowering the people who are taking the actions themselves. Other comments on?
Yeah, the one thing I would say is about recognizing that women aren't a homogenous, monolithic group. So, and I think one of the challenges for the SDGs is sort of getting, obviously gender disaggregation is really important, or sex disaggregation, but also by other kinds of difference or inequality or whatever. I mean, some disability was mentioned, and I don't want to give that short shrift because, disabled women and men are among the most marginalized. But, disaggregating by sex, but also by age, by income, by rural, urban location, will get you to a much richer kind of set of data on what's really happening. And I think that's a really important step.
Yeah, that's very consistent with what I was going to comment on. Is I think you have to first ask, whose reality are you trying to measure? And then based on whose reality you're trying to measure, I would suggest having that sample of people somehow involved in framing of the questions that you're going to eventually ask. And then, as John said, having that part of the population also doing the enumeration so that there's more trust and access. I think those things are critical. And then the only other thing I would add is, I think when we bring new data into the public domain, there has to be an investment in animating policymakers to understand why this matters. And I always use a bellwether of, like, when the World Bank picks up an issue, all of a sudden everybody understands it, and all of a sudden there's a ton of research around it, and then everybody's talking about it. That's hugely helpful, but until something like that happens, a lot of time the data we might be bringing forward, policymakers don't understand why this is important. So you can disaggregate it or you can frame it differently, but they need some education as to why this is going to help them spend public resources more effectively.
Excellent questions, excellent contributions all. I really appreciate your coming to this session and having the opportunity to be part of it. Any last words from either of you?
Just thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Go get them.